All right. Victor Antonio, what's going on, man? How are you today?
I'm doing good, man. How about yourself, DJ?
I'm feeling good. Yeah, things are on the up. Like I said, it's always good to have a fellow bald brother in here on the show.
Bald brothers unite, brother. Bald brothers unite.
That's it, man. The bald mafia. That's what I like to call it.
There you go. There you go. I love it.
So, what's going on, man? I mean, you looking at your background, we have kind of a lot in common. So you grew up in Chicago, but now you're in Atlanta. So kind of walk me through that.
Man, so it's been a long journey. So born and raised in Chicago. My family is originally from Puerto Rico, but they moved to Chicago in the late 50s. So I was born there in Chicago. And so I went to school, got an engineering degree, thought that was the thing to do. When I graduated with my engineering degree, I went to got my first job in Minnesota. Yeah, sure, you betcha, man. Ludafisk and Left Side, all that stuff. Oli and Lena. If you're from the Midwest, you just understood what I said. If you're not, don't worry about it. Move on. And so I lived in Minnesota for a while. Got into from engineering. I went into sales while I was there. Then got offered a vice president of sales for Latin America. So I actually moved down to Argentina. Took the whole family down to Argentina. We were down there for quite a while. And after about 2 years, I moved back. My wife said, let's go back to Minnesota. I'm like, I don't think so. And so we wound up going to Miami. We were in Miami for 5 years. My wife's like, I don't like it here. And when the wife says, I don't like it here, it's time to move. So we negotiated Georgia just because it has a great airport and I can travel from there. I didn't want to go back up north. And she wanted to leave Miami, so we settled in Georgia. And that's how we got to Atlanta.
Fantastic, man. Well, so we have kind of a few things in common. So I'm actually calling you right now from Chicago. I don't know if you knew that. But I'm also an engineer turned podcaster turned entrepreneur. So
really?
how did you because for most people, electrical engineering and sales couldn't be more disconnected. So how was that transition made in your career?
Yeah, so what happened was I got into engineering, and people always ask me why. I go, money. What else? And so I went into engineering because we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and so I wanted a career that actually paid, had a good ROI, and so I was told engineers make a lot of money. So I decided on electrical engineering, and so 3 years into my gig, man, DJ, I'm not digging this anymore, man. I'm just like, programming, writing software, testing parts, whatever it may be. And so little by little, I started moving towards what they call application engineer, which is a little more removed from the actual, programming. Application engineers, where you work with salespeople to help them design systems. I was designing wireless systems at the time. And so I was traveling with salespeople designing wireless systems. I would add, we do four-legged calls, if you remember what that is where you go with the salesperson does all the schmoozing, so to speak, setting it up, and like, all right, Victor, you take it over, give them all the technical stuff. And so it would be, the yin and yang. And after a while, true story is that we sold a $5 million system. I built a $5 million system, DJ. Ken, the salesperson, calls me one day and said, dude, we sold it. And I think I mentioned one of the stories in my podcast. And we sold the system. Ken says, dude, I am taking you out to lunch. So he takes me out to lunch. I swear to you, he drops about $50 on me on a steak and a beer. And I'm all happy, little young engineer coming back to the office, all happy with my big belly full of a steak and a beer. And this old engineer, his name was Roy. Roy's like, what are you so happy about? I said, man, Ken took me out for a piece of steak. It was great. It was awesome. And Roy said, Victor, let me ask you a question. I said, what? He says, how much did he drop on you? I said, he had to drop at least, $50, half a C note. And he goes, how much commission do you think you'll make on that system? And I go, I don't know. He says, somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000. Hope you enjoyed that steak. And he just walked away. And at that point, I go, wait a minute. I designed the system. I think I could do this. And so that coincided with my wife deciding she wanted to stay home and take care of the kids and not let the child be raised in daycare. So I said, if I go into sales, I can make more money. She says, go into sales. It requires a lot of traveling, and that was the agreement. I would have to travel a lot, and that's how I got into sales. I've been money-driven for a long time, DJ. I just have to confess that right away.
Hey, I'm with you, man. I mean, money does a lot of great things for a lot of people. So I'm on board with that.
Yeah, I do. By the way, I've coined the phrase. I'm taking ownership of this one because people always say money doesn't buy happiness. And my new response is money guarantees you one thing, and that is options. You think about that. Money doesn't guarantee you a lot of things, but it will guarantee you options. So if you want to send your kid to a private school, send them to a private school. You want to send them to a public school, go. You want to quit the job, not quit the job. You want to go on vacation, not vacation. Whatever you want to be happy, not happy. Money does guarantee you options. And I think that's a good way of looking at money.
Absolutely. You kind of transition, you understand the importance of sales and kind of transition your career that way. Walk me through, how does that, your career trajectory take you over to eventually starting a podcast about 3 years ago.
Yeah, and so what happened was, I'll go through the story real quickly. So left engineering, got into sales. Things are going well. Champion, right? Killing it, making big money. Years before that, he's seen a speaker named Zig Ziglar. Don't know if you know who he is, but he's a speaker. I saw him one time. I said, one day I want to be just like him. So in the back of my mind, I wanted to be a speaker. And so sure enough, May 9th, 2001, 3:48 p.m. to be exact, I quit corporate America. I just said, I'm done. And it was building for a long time, but that was the day I pulled the trigger, made the call. That's how I know the time. And I called the chairman. I was president of sales and marketing. It was a $420 million company, but I wanted to do my own thing. I had this thing which I have called the quiet discontent. And the quiet discontent is that feeling you get in the pit of your stomach like, man, I'm just not, I'm not doing my thing. You know what I mean? And so I quit and I said, I'm going to be a speaker. I'm going to write books. So since then, I've written 13 books. I do a lot of my keynotes are mostly sales / motivation, a lot of sales training. And then about 3 years ago, well, first of all, I listened to Gary Vaynerchuk and read his book about 10, 11 years ago, Crush It. And Gary was the one that kind of talked me into going into video, all in with video. So I have about, 1,100, 1,200 videos on YouTube now. And then about 2.5 years ago, even though Gary was saying podcast, I was I don't know. And then so about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, something like that, I made the plunge. I said, let me do some podcasts. And this month will be the first month we hit 100,000 downloads. So wow. I'm actually very proud of that.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
That's congratulations on hitting that milestone.
Man. Slow building, dude, but I got there, DJ. I got there. 100,000, man. I'm getting there. This month will be the first month, man. We're on track. We're at like 72,000 already. I just checked. So we're
perfect. Cool. Yeah. And by the way, we're recording this on the 17th of July. So yeah, you got a lot of runway. You're more than half of the month, or roughly half the month.
14 more days. I'm counting.
Awesome. Yeah. Who's counting, right? Well, so how was that transition? Was it a pretty natural progression for you going from the video format to podcasting?
It was. I think going through the video actually helped me do the podcast that much easier. Because when you're video, I think you're more self-conscious of how you look, the lighting, your bald head, whatever it may be, And so there's something about a podcast. It's just your voice. And I keep getting a lot of comments. I really like your voice, Victor. I really like your voice. I really like, to hear your voice. And so that was part of jumping into it. But I was also seeing that the market was moving in that direction because I started seeing myself listening to more podcasts. You know how you kind of use yourself as a litmus test sometimes? Well, I'm starting to listen to more podcasts. Maybe I should really do some podcasts. So for those people who've listened to my podcast, they're 10 to 15 minutes, right? And the way I got there was I was talking to a friend of mine, and I asked him, do you listen to podcasts? He goes, no. You go, why? He says, they're very good stuff out there, very informative. He goes, yeah, it's too long, Victor. I can't dedicate 45 minutes. And I said, so what would you dedicate? And he said, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I'll dedicate 15 minutes. And so the longest I've gone, unless it's an interview, is 15 minutes. But typically I try to keep it around 10 minutes. And my strategy is, as you pointed out, I tell a story, make a point, tie them together, and then say, here's how it applies to you. That's my formula. Here's a story. Or here's a piece of data. Here's the point I want to make, and then here's how it applies to you. That's the straight up formula of all my podcasts.
Yeah, is that how you kind of start? I mean, going back through your backlog, it seems like that has been the format since day one.
Yes.
How did you kind of come? Is that just how you operate?
Yeah, that's the way my brain thinks. The engineering part kicks in a lot sometimes. The engineering part says I see a piece of data, right? Like for example, Forrester says, the average buyer is 74% into the buying process. Okay, that means they formed their preferences, right? So you go, what do I do with that one? So wait a minute, I've met customers who pretty much know what they want already. All right, so I get those two pieces of data, right? Oh, that's what Forrester says. And well, that's kind of true because people seem to know what they want. So then I tell a story. Then I just set it up and I go, hey, this is Victor Antonio, Sales Influence Podcast, blah, blah, blah. Hey, say, came across an interesting piece of data. 74% of buyers are in the buying process, blah, 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 blah. I said, that makes sense because the other day I was talking to a customer, and he had gone online, he had done research, he looked at like 10 different websites, so that makes sense. Now, how does this apply to you? If they're going online to look for maybe you should be online so they can find your information and then be part of the buying process. That's it. This is Victor Antonio. I'm out of here. That's kind of the podcast right there.
Yeah, and that's what I was mentioning it before we started recording here, but you do such a good job of telling the story and hooking the audience and making I listened to a few of your episodes and I'm like, oh, I already know way more about sales because I can internalize these concepts through these stories. which I think is an incredible art. How long did it take you because from episode 1 to where you're at today, there's obviously been a huge progression. How long did it take for you to really feel like you had honed your voice as a podcaster?
I would say it took me about 50.
Okay.
The first 50, kind of just like figuring it out. I don't think it was that long, but if I were to throw a number off the top of my head, I think it was 50, where I'm like, okay, I'm feeling this. Because then you start layering other things. So if you listen to my podcast, you'll see different elements start to come in. I start to tell slower stories. I stop to drop my voice. Now here's what's going to happen. You start doing stuff like that. And then you just start adding more drama to it. And then you can just start having fun. And so I learned that formula, by the way. I belonged to an organization years ago called Toastmasters. Toastmasters is a speaking organization where you learn how to speak. And the basic formula is story point. Tell a story, make a point. And that was usually, if you look at a keynote, you look at all my keynotes, it's story point. I tell a story, make a point. Tell a story, another point, make a point. But then I added the third element, tell a story, make a point, or point, story, story point. Take your combination, and then always, here's how it applies to you. And then I think that's the hook. When I added that element, I think people go, oh, okay, I can see how I can use that now. So I always try to throw in something that you can use it this way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and that kind of also it's interesting because to a certain extent you're eating your own dog food, because a lot of times that's how you market and sell is the same way, right? Is through the power of stories. Would you agree?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd eat my own dog food, but I mean, I guess we can go there. You do. No, you're right, DJ, because that we've all heard this, right? People remember stories, right? We hear that a lot. People remember stories, and so I've learned that I can data dump somebody. And by the way, I used to just data dump, and then I pulled back. So let me just add some stories, add a little bit of humor. Don't be afraid to and I think this is the part that started appearing after episode 100, and that is, and we're at 230 right now, and that is you start kind of like being yourself a little bit. I'll say being vulnerable a little bit, being more open. You know what I mean? And, that's when you really get comfortable, and I think that's when people really start to connect even more. And that's just my opinion. But I feel the difference now. I get more feedback when I confess something that happened to me. They go, oh, it happened to him. Like if I did something stupid and I just fess up, I did something stupid. Let me tell you what I did. And they're like, oh, my God, he makes stupid mistakes too. Yeah, of course, I'm human. Stuff happens. But I think being able to share some of your personal, I don't want to say tragedies. They're not tragedies, but, issues or incidents, I think is really good in a podcast.
100%. I think that's why people love podcasts, right? Is it gives you a chance to be authentic and vulnerable with people. Is there a particular episode early on that you employed that strategy and practice vulnerable stories or behavior and saw a positive result that clicks for you?
No, nothing clicks. I just remember telling the story. I hate talking. In this intro we just did, for this podcast, notice I skipped over my family came from Puerto Rico and went to engineering school. And I hate talking about myself. That's why I kind of shoot through that stuff real quick. And so that's been very difficult for me. I joke, food stamps, government cheese, powdered milk, if you know where the Cabrini Green housing projects in Humboldt Park is in Chicago back in the day, drugs, gangs, violence, the whole bit. I got stories, man. I got stories. No people in the cemetery, no people in prison, that type of thing. But it's really hard for me to talk about myself. And I think that has been my biggest challenge with podcasts and even with speaking, that I really don't like talking about myself. But people say you got to do more of it. And so I guess it's been trying to leak out little by little. That's the most honest statement I can give you as far as how I've been trying to incorporate this. Because, again, sometimes it seems too self-aggrandizing,
Right. It's such a fine line because,
it is.
It's such a buzzword of, just be authentic, but you can't shoehorn that into a podcast, right?
Right. And the thing is, everybody has a sad story. Do you know what I mean? Even if you were raised with a silver spoon, I bet you I can find a sad story in your life. Everybody has gone through some personal tragedy or personal experience. But truth be told, I just did a podcast called Deep Storytelling. And I think it's 227 or something like that. And I went to see I hear a speaker, and they kept talking about the speaker, DJ. I'm like, let me go see the speaker because I like to study great speakers. And then I talk about this in the podcast. I go listen to the guy, and there's nothing special about him. And the stories he's telling, I was like, I know where you're going, dude. I can meet you at the end. Do you know what I mean? I can run to the end. But then he did something surprising. He started peeling back the onion on that story, the layers. And then he started getting a little more personal and becoming, I'll use the word vulnerable. on stage. And he did it in such a way that you just connected with the guy. And I said, here he is. And this is only like maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago I heard this guy. And he reminded me it's okay to do that if you know how to do it the right way. So now my challenge going forward is how do I implement some of that stuff without being self-aggrandizing? Like, woe is me, look how poor I was. Because I don't want to say nobody gives a rip, but nobody gives a rip.
Yeah, it's true. That's a good point. Yeah, because it's like if it's done right, it's one of the most powerful tools. Right. But if it's done inauthentically, I guess to use that word, there's nothing cheesier, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes when I hear people just really lay it on with their help, poor, this, my young friend got killed when I was young. I witnessed this. I witnessed that. I seen this. I get that. I get that where you have to share some of that. But if I'm in the audience sitting there, maybe that's just because I'm an engineer. I'm, more like, left brain than right brain. That when I hear too much of that, I'm just like, I shut down. You know what I mean? So I have a very skewed perspective because some people are like, oh my God, that was so interesting. That was so fascinating, right? And I'm like, that was boring, because I've heard, and so, but some people really love that. And so I got to, as you say, learn to walk that fine line between authenticity and inauthenticity. It's tough.
Yeah, I totally get that, man, because like I'm a very cynical person myself. It's like when I hear people going very deep into those personal details and like oversharing, it's like, what are you trying to get out of this? What are you trying to prime me for? You know what I mean?
It's too much oversharing sometimes. I'm like, all right, pull back. And plus, when I go hear a speaker, I need new perspectives. That's what I'm looking for. I'm sitting here. I'm giving you an hour of my time. Please shift my paradigm. I don't need to cry. I don't need to get in touch with my inner self, and I don't need to get in touch with my feminine self. I just don't. You know what I mean? I come here, boom, I want content. And so when I hear too much storytelling like that, I don't like it. But I do like stories that have a point. And then here's how it applies to you. I go, oh, okay, that's great. Because there's nothing, if you have a great point to make and you wrap it into a great story, man, it's just more memorable. It's more sticky. And I love that.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're a master of it on your show. So let's talk about the process kind of for you of creating the show and the stories that you're working on. What does that look like? Do you have kind of like a catalog of different stories, or is it like something when something happens to you or you hear a number like you said, you just like write down a note and then write about it later? Or what does that process and content calendar look like for you?
I'll show you what I got here. I'll show you. It's a show and tell right now. I know.
Oh, perfect.
So look, so you'll see that this is not an exaggeration. So these are like index cards. You can see this. And it's like massive amount of index cards.
Man.
And so what happens is, and I'll just try to show you on the camera so you can just see some of these. I can go all day with these. And then I do a lot of writing. By the way, these aren't all my index cards. And so what happens is I hear something, I read a book, and you get the idea, man. It's like a lot. And so what happens is I have index cards in my drawer, right? I really have them all over the house. And so and by the way, this is, I think, the ultimate strategy because I have them everywhere, right? And so when, let's say I'm walking, the only time I don't have an index card is when I'm walking, but then I write it in my notes. So sometimes I walk for 20 minutes a day. And then what I do is I put on a meditative instrumental, like, something like that, just told. And what it does, after like 10 minutes, I just go into this trance for some reason. It's just the weirdest thing. You're just walking and your mind just goes. And all of a sudden, concepts begin to fly in your head about what you want to talk about. That's one way I do it. When I have something happen to me at the store, I immediately put it in my phone real quick, just a couple of words to trigger me. Or when I get home, I just write it on one of the index cards. 3 is I read a lot. So I try to read one book a week. As I read the book, it's too bad I don't have them up here because this is just one book, but this is not. I note these things up. And so what I do is I'm reading, I see something usually triggers me. Like if I see a data point, I go, huh. And then I write the data point down. And then I said, oh yeah, let's tie it to this concept. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden I just start stacking them like you see here. And then you can't see it, but my podcast station is over there. And then what I do is I simply just, this is not joking. I know people can't see this. I just walked over to my podcast station. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? These are the next 5 episodes right here. So these are already set up at the podcast station. Now, this is a little bigger than an index card. So what I do is I take it from an index card, and then I just transfer it over here so I can have the full concept. And then this becomes my 10-minute podcast. And that's how I do it.
Oh, very cool. That's a very engineered approach to.
It's so engineered. By the way, it's the way I do my speeches also. So in my speeches, I write on each card story point, story point, story point. Every card represents story point. Each card is typically a 5-minute module. So if I got an hour to speak, then obviously for each 5 minutes, I typically take about maybe 7 of them, right? And I begin to weave them together. You think, wait a minute, that's 35. But there's a lot of bridging between concepts, a lot of injection of humor, whatever it may be, audience interaction. And so then what I do is I move the cards around on my desk if I want to change the sequence of my speech. So what I do is I think in modules.
Wow, I like that. That's a very systematic approach. I also I'm curious because the book you showed for those of you that can't see, it looked extremely marked up with Post-its and stuff. Yeah. How do you power through a book a week with all of those annotations and processing all of that information? That seems like a lot of work.
I read this a while back and it really helped. When you pick up a book, so 2 rules. One is when you pick up a book, understand why you're reading that book. So I say to myself, the reason I'm reading this book is I want sales tips that I have not covered in my course, in my podcast, or something that would trigger me, right? So I do that. And then, so that's one way. I also have the 100-page rule. If after 100 pages, this book is junk, I stop reading it, I donate it to Goodwill. Okay? Because it's not fulfilling my purpose. Usually the first 100 pages is the best stuff. I just read one called Atomic Habits. Oh my God, I went through that one twice. And that one took me 2 weeks to go through because it was that big, that good, that juicy. But that book was worth 2 or 3 other books, if you know what I mean, because it was that good. But typically, I just powered through one in about 3 days. One called Sales Stampede. I'll do a book review on that one. It's a really good book on selling from the front of the room. A lot of good data points. And from that one, I got maybe 4 index cards. 4 ideas. Those are 4 podcasts. So imagine that if each book you can get at least 3 ideas. Just 3. And then boom, you go to the next book. Do you know what I mean? But typically, I finish my books about maybe 70% of the time. I finish my books. Like end to end, like really read them through. And then rare is a moment like Atomic Habits where you read that thing twice, you go, it's still too good. It's really good. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where do you, because if you have a 70% hit rate on them, I mean, it sounds like you're getting good inputs into the system. So where are you finding recommendations for books?
Good question. So, when you go to Amazon, it's always doing some recommendations at the bottom. And I really look at those reviews, and then I look at the topic, and I said, is it like 1 degree off center? I don't want to read the same thing about selling all the time or influence or persuasion. So, like this one that this was just a friend recommended this thing called Sales Stampede by Dave D. And he said, this guy sells from the front of the room. He does a lot of neuro-linguistic programming, and he's known to be able to create a sales stampede to the back of the room. I'm like, well, how does he do that? Well, that sounds interesting. Let me read that book. And it was a fascinating book. And so when people recommend books, I log them into my Amazon account. You know how those you can actually put in your watch list? And so my watch list is loaded. So I'm not starving for books to choose from. And then sometimes, something pops up on the radar. You say, yeah, I think I'll get that book. So I have at least about 5 books always on hold in my office waiting for me.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good strategy. And you kind of flip through and pick whatever one grabs you the most.
Correct. And like I said, sometimes you want to do something a little different. Like the Atomic Habits was like, I was at the airport. I go, Atomic Habits, interesting. Look through a couple of pages. Let me do that. 2-3 weeks ago, about a month ago, I was with at a presentation, and I don't know if you know who Daniel Pink is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, Daniel Pink, he wrote Drive and Selling is Human, and he's got a new book called When. So he did this 20-minute presentation on when. I was like, oh, my God, I got to get that book. So I just ordered the book right there with my phone, and it's waiting for me at home. So that's why I always have a stack of books.
Awesome. Well, God bless Amazon, our boy Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also part of Bald Mafia now. But So let's talk about you're obviously, congratulations, you're going to hit 100,000 downloads this month. It's getting to that point obviously takes time and a lot of effort. You mentioned you started with YouTube and you kind of cut your teeth making over 1,000 YouTube videos, but how have you gone about growing your podcast audience over the last 3 years?
How did I do that? I mean, it's really a lot of things coming together. The videos are driving a lot of traffic to the site. And there you can find my podcast as well. And so I use you probably use Libsyn, Liberated Syndicate. If you don't know what that is, it's a podcast service that basically disseminates everything on iTunes. What is it? Stitcher,
Google Podcasts,
you get the idea.
Spotify. Yep.
But yeah, and what's also interesting, I don't know if you looked at where your traffic is coming from, but all of a sudden you've seen podcasts that you've never heard of before. So it's disseminating even further into the net. Like Podbean was one I just heard. I go, where'd that one come from? But they're carrying my podcast as well. And so one of the tricks I've used to really grow my podcast, here it comes, this is special, is that I took the audio, and then if you go online, you'll see it. I put a graphic with a little pulsating thing on it, if you've seen them on YouTube. So I dual purpose the podcast. I load it up so you can listen to it, or you can watch it, so to speak, on YouTube as well. And on YouTube, I already had a great following. We're up to I think 170,000 subs. And so that also powers, the actual podcast. So I leverage YouTube to actually drive traffic to my actual podcast.
Yeah, because I noticed that. I was wondering how those YouTube videos with the static graphics have been performing pretty well for you.
Very well. Like I said, I wish the counts were higher because I think my content is that good, but people want to see my face. And so the counts are typically about 1,000, 2,000, but I believe in the long tail effect. You know what I mean? I have about maybe 3 videos that have passed the 1 million mark. But then there's that long tail of, 20,000 here, 5,000 there, 1,000 there, kind of a bunch of those. When you get 1,000 plus videos, all that stuff begins to add up. So we're doing traffic is falling a little bit. I think YouTube has done an algorithm jigger, because we were doing about 4,000 subs a month, and we're about 2,000 subs a month. I mean, still not bad, but, when you're at 4,000, you're like, okay, now I got to build back up again. So, but that has been the biggest, I guess, leverage point, using my YouTube channel to push that. And so right now, my new push, if you look at my Instagram account, I'm going into IGTV. I'm taking the same video, which is really, again, the audio with just a static picture and a little pulsing thing, and I'm putting it on Instagram TV. And I just started doing that about 2-3 days ago. We'll see how that works.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear how that works. Have you experimented or thought about doing just like solo video for your podcast as a companion?
What do you mean, a solo video? Just like me talking and looking into the camera?
Yeah, just literally turning on a video while you record the podcast.
By the way, we're in the process of doing that right now. So I'm putting together something called I have no other name for it. So for now, it's the Victor Antonio Show, and it's going to be a 30 to 40 minute format where we're going to talk about my topic's going to be money, music, motivation, and maybe talk about a movie at the end. So I'm going to try to combine business and entertainment a little bit. And basically, it's a self-serving podcast where I'm just going to talk about what I want to talk about. Do you know what I mean? When it comes to talking about money, I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. And then I'm going to throw in a song. I just heard this song, this new cut from da-da-da-da-da. Let's play that one. You know what I mean? And then jump into some motivation. Here's what I read recently. And then, hey, this is the movie I went to see this week. Or here's something I binged on this weekend. And so we're creating that right now. And hopefully we'll launch that August 1st. And so that's going to be a longer format. No guests. So for now, but maybe down the road we will do that. But for right now, that's the Victor Antonio Show coming. And that's just going to be more like, I just want to start enjoying this even more by talking about what I want to talk about. I should emphasize, in case you don't ask me this question, but I'm sure you will, is that how has it helped financially? And that is these podcasts. I can't tell you how many times I'm a speaker, so I get booked a lot, to speak or do sales workshops. And I can't tell you how many times somebody says, look, I've been listening to your podcast for more than a year now. I finally told my vice president we had to bring you in, da-da-da-da-da. And sure enough, they pay me. I come in. I do my thing. So, the podcast has had a great return on investment. Yeah,
well, that's what I was going to ask, kind of how the podcast is played into all of the ridiculous amounts of awesome content you have. I mean, you mentioned
Right.
13 books,
Right.
1,000 plus YouTube videos now, 250 plus podcast episodes. You have this massive just log of content. So are you just getting tons of inbound then
It's all
at this
inbound.
point?
I haven't made a cold call in years. I got to be honest, I haven't. So all the business I get is all inbound. And, I always emphasize to people that video, marketing online, podcast now is just another layer. It works if you work it, but the trick is to be consistent over time. So our schedule is this, 1 video, 2 podcasts every week. So we post on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Sundays. And we post in the evening at 7 p.m. That's our new time frame. And so we now know that that's what we have to do. So all I got to do is come up with 2 podcasts and 1 video, every week. And that's not hard to do, especially if you're reading a lot of content. People always tell me, don't you get tired of talking about sales? Haven't you run out of stuff to talk about? There's so many permutations to selling because there's so many different industries. There's so many different styles of selling. There's so many new style studies coming out. And also the market continues to change. Like my most recent book was on artificial intelligence, how it's changing the world of selling. And so all this stuff is happening, and I'm almost like it's like a reporter just documenting what's going on. And so, I hate the word legacy, I really do, but I do like to think of all the content I produce as a body of work. And so my goal is just to just create this body of work that maybe it'll help somebody. That's my mindset.
Absolutely. One other question that I skipped over going back to growing the show. Have you been doing a lot? So obviously you're a guest here on Behind the Podcast. Thank you again for coming on. But is that something you typically do? Did you find interviewing on other shows has helped grow your reach, and if so, how?
I don't know if it's helped grow the business, but I'm that guy that if I got time, I'm doing a podcast. Like I didn't know who you were, and you said I'm just starting out, and I said I don't care. Let me get on your podcast. For all I know, tomorrow you're going to be the next Joe Rogan. I was like, yeah, I should have gotten on his podcast. So right before this one, I was on a podcast with Chris Widener. He's talking about speakers, in the speaking business. And so, this month I think I have maybe 4 or 5 interviews people want to do with me. So I really just try to say yes to everybody. No matter how small or how big you are, I just try to say yes if it fits in my schedule. So how is that impacted, DJ? I haven't tracked it. I don't know. But I got to believe it's all cumulative, my friend. It's all cumulative.
So that's so interesting. And I appreciate and I resonate a lot with what you're saying of like, let's play the long-term games over and over. And you also seem like as a guy who reads, tries to read a book a week and you're constantly putting out stuff. It seems like you're a very open-minded guy. So like, how did you cultivate that open-mindedness?
Oh my God, nobody's ever asked me that question. Open-mindedness. You reminded me of an Ayn Rand statement. Ayn Rand, do you know who Ayn Rand is?
Yeah, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Right.
Those
So
books.
Ayn Rand said, never have an open mind because people can throw anything in there. Never have a closed mind because you'll never learn anything. He says, always have an active critical mind. And so I like to think that's what I have. And so 2 things. Why did I say yes to DJ when I didn't even know him, right? That's because I remember when I was coming up in the speaking business, I didn't get a lot of people who wanted to help me. And I said, that's really punkish of people not to want to help. I said, I won't do that. When somebody's getting started and I have speakers who call me, email me, and I just said, if I can say yes, I'll say yes. That's been my mindset. You know what I mean? Only because I've been there where, damn, so the only reason you want to talk to me is when I get big. But right now, when I'm trying to get started, nobody wants to talk to me. And I'm like, I told myself, don't do that to people. Don't, put them in the box like, DJ, you can't help me right now. So right now, I don't want to talk to you. If I can be so blunt, that's kind of shitty. Right. And so I've decided not to be that person. So that's one. And so I'm really open. Now, I read a lot because I like when people tell me things and I go, now let me go check it out. Let me go check it out for myself. And if I can be, okay, this is the part that's going to be really revealing here. Okay, this is the part that's the vulnerable piece, the authentic piece. So this is probably the deepest I'm going to go with this, but I'll do my best not to go too deep. So my mother had a 3rd grade education. My father had a 5th grade education. Spoke no English when they moved to Chicago, right? My mother was like, go to school, get the education, get the JOB. Got it, Mom. Go to school. we were raised in a neighborhood where it was very isolated. You know, it was pretty much half black, half Hispanic. If you saw a white person there, you're like, what are you doing around here? It's like a spotted wild owl. You know, it's like, where'd that come from? Right? And it wasn't until I got to college that now I had to like blend with the world, so to speak. You know, it's more international. But in the neighborhood, you know, we weren't taught to read. And even through college, I hated reading. When I got into corporate America, you know, I didn't know how to fit in. I can't explain it. It's like I came from the hood. I had an engineering degree, but I didn't fit in. And so one of the things, and I don't know how I decided to do this, but I did, is that I noticed people were always reading a book, a business book, you know. And I said, you know what? I'm going to read what they're reading. And by they, I mean executives, people in business in general, right? And so I started doing that. Like that, when a conversation came up or I wanted to initiate a conversation, I could say, hey, what'd you think of that book? I just finished reading it. Or when we were in general conversation, I was able to insert myself. And that was my way of transcending and being able to connect with people because I was well read, you know, and people go, okay, this guy's well read. And you can see it, DJ. They look at you differently. And that was the drug for me. That I realized that knowledge truly is power, especially if it's applied. But just having this critical knowledge really helped me in terms of having conversations with people and being able to discuss business concepts or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. I relate a lot to that. Like I also, you know, being very blessed to grow up in the internet age, there's so much you could learn anything, right? Yeah. I mean, with YouTube, books, free courses now. It would be a shame if you didn't explore your curiosities and get out there, right?
Well, think about it. When I was coming up, remember, there was no internet. Around that time, there was no internet still. I know you're thinking, really? Was there a time that no internet existed, Victor? How old are you, brother? So, you know, the internet was just not even, you know, it was the thought of the internet was still there. ARPANET is all we knew at the time, right? And so, you know, I remember going to the bookstore, the secondhand bookstores, the used bookstores, just to get these books. And so that was old school, right, where you actually drove to the bookstore just to get books. And so now you're right. There is no excuse for not learning anything. I mean, it's how do you curate the information you want to learn? Because there's so much of it.
Right, 100%. So getting back to podcasting here, what in the 3 years you've been podcasting, what have you loved the most about the medium as a whole or just producing a show?
I think for me, it's that, you know, when I read, because again, natural reader, it's almost like an outlet. Do you know what I mean? Like release the pressure valve a little bit. And that is what I like about it. But I also, again, when I talked about, I view it as a body of work, is I learned something, I learned a concept. Let me document this through a podcast. Let me just document this. Let me talk about it. And that to me is a verbal documentation of a piece of knowledge I have. Now, what's really fascinating is that, you know, I'll go back and listen to one of my old podcasts. I'm like, oh, my God, I totally forgot that. Because we can't keep it all up here, right? We just can't. Our retention isn't that great. And so it's always fascinating when I go back to one of my earlier podcasts, I go, oh, wow, I totally forgot this subject. And I think that's a personal kick I get, right? But I think to me, a podcast is an outlet to document something, a way of thinking. And what's even more fascinating is that when you listen to my earlier podcasts, for me, is like, I don't know if I agree totally with that 100%. Now, I would add this spin to it. And now I would add another layer on it. So you almost see yourself growing through your podcast as well. I don't know if that makes sense, but...
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you, as humans, we have all of these thoughts, right, that race through our heads, but a podcast forces you to articulate it and put concrete words. Like it's the same that journaling and writing does, but podcasting even one step further, right? Forces you to articulate and get those ideas out into the wild.
I like that better. It's like audio journaling. You know what I mean? And then so I love that phrase, DJ. Much better. You know how sometimes something sounds good in your head? You know, it sounds really good in your head.
All the time.
Yeah, it sounds really good in your head. It's like if you're a guy, you remember when you wanted to talk to that girl and the night before you kind of rehearsed your lines, you know, like, all right, here's what I'm going to say. She's probably going to say this. I'm going to say that. She's going to say that. And, oh, man, it sounds really good. Then you get there. It's all messed up, right? Well, not sometimes. A lot of times it sounds really good in my head. And then when I write it out on my index card, I go, Something missing. There's a piece missing. And I can tell when something's missing. And I go, and then what you don't see is how many edits I go through. So typically I go through about maybe at least 2 or 3 tries before I finally get it. This is after I know what I'm talking about. Now let me do it. And that's the frustrating piece about it. It's really frustrating. And by the way, I use, just to share what I use, and I don't know if it's available anymore, and I'm afraid that if I delete it off my phone, I'm screwed. I use something called Boss Jock.
Okay.
Boss, B-O-S-S, Jock, J-O-C-K. That's the app I use. I have an iPhone, and I can't find it anymore, but it's still on my phone, right? And what I love about Boss Jock is that, you plug it in, you get the special box. You can use, an XLR, microphone, but it has, where you can actually put the music into these little cartridges, those carts. Mm-hmm. So I can hit the intro music, and then when I start talking, hit it again, it outros itself. And then when I finish the podcast, hit it in, intro and outro it again, and there's zero editing. Zero editing. So the podcast itself is done. Then I just send it over to my son, who's an audio genius, and he cleans it up for me, gives me that little crunchy sound, And so that's how I do it. But Boss Jock is an app I use. Hopefully they got it back up again.
Awesome. What has been your biggest struggle to date with the podcast? Is there anything that you're struggling with right now?
I think it was just trying to grow get to 100,000 faster, and then the other thing everybody struggles with, right, is the discipline to stick to it. Because, sometimes I got to yell at myself. Like, come on, Victor. It's only 2. That's all you got to do. You got to do 2. Just go do 2, and you got to talk yourself into do it. Even when it's all written out, I still got to talk myself. Sometimes you go, is anybody listening? I think the first 50 to 100, you're like, is anybody listening? Does anybody care? And you almost have to put your head down and not pay attention. Did the same thing with my YouTube video. I was getting like 10, 15 views. I'm like, oh, what am I doing? Am I wasting my time? And so if you're listening to this, you've got to push through. I would give everybody the challenge. You've got to produce at least 100. Mm. That's your number.
That seems like the magic number, right?
Yeah,
to get that stickiness. Yeah. Well, so you kind of mentioned it. We talked about, you do 2 episodes per week. Do you ever record in advance and batch process episodes, or is it all very fresh weekly content?
No, batch process. Great question. So right now I got podcasts recorded all the way through September, mid-September already. They're in the pipe, so to speak. And that's because I've learned to take advantage of, sometimes you're just feeling the mojo. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes you're just in the flow, man. And I've learned that once I'm in the flow, just go, man. Just keep producing them and just keep producing them, especially if they're already written out. Because I know there's going to be a time where I'm not going to want to do any, right? And so right now, I think I'm 2 months out with podcasts already. So it's like I can sit back. But what I'll do now is I'll power through and just continue to do more. My speaking schedule picks up at the end of August, beginning of September. So now these are already in the pipe. But I'm trying to get, stuff all the way out through October, maybe November. So when I'm speaking on the road, I don't have to worry about it. So that's a great question. So I do a lot of batch processing.
Okay.
Yeah,
nice. Yeah,
great
that's it.
Great question.
It's like a good way to feel like you're getting ahead a little bit. But yeah, I agree with the as a writer as well. Like when you get the motivation wave, ride it as far as it'll take you. Squeeze out
one
every
of the things
drop.
I do. This is just a personal tip because people always say, "How do you write 13 books?" And do these podcasts. What I do is my routine is to get up at 5:30, typically about 5, right? By 5:30, I'm at Starbucks, right? And so from 5:30 to 7:30, I just create or read. So I'm reading something and then I'm usually creating something. And so those are my 2 golden hours. Dan Ariely, who wrote the book Predictably Irrational, he's like a neuroscientist. He said everybody has 2 golden hours where you're just boom, man, that's your flow. Like my son is totally opposite from me. His flow begins like at 1 a.m. That's where his flow begins. But if I can ask you, DJ, what do you think your 2-hour flow is where it's like, man, you can just focus and stuff gets done?
Yeah, I relate with the morning thing. I like to typically get going about an hour after waking up, either wake up and go for a walk or get a read in and then grab a cup of coffee and get to work. So I agree. I relate to that.
Yeah. And so what I do is so my routine is be there. I'm usually sitting down by 5:30. I got a 2-hour ambient mix no words, just ambient music, as I mentioned. Got my Bose noise cancellation deal, so I don't hear anything else. And I just go into a trance, man. I just get stuff done. And that's how I get a lot of reading done. And then some of these podcasts. And if I don't get anything done for the rest of the day, I don't feel bad. Because I know that 2 hours was at least worth 4 hours of content development.
That's so powerful because, then the rest of the day you're just playing on house money, essentially, right?
That's it. Good way of looking at it. The book When by Daniel Pink, it's really fascinating because he talks about these natural cycles that most of us are in, like 80%. And what he found out when he looked at, they studied tweets, they studied, what do you call those, stock market calls where you got to do the call at the end of the quarter, the annual report calls. And he found out that basically most of us are morning people. And in the morning, when you're in the morning, that's when you should do your heavy lifting, right? Then he said after 11 o'clock, sometimes 12, depending on the curve, he says from 11 to about 5, we just drop. Everything gets negative. In fact, even the tweets are more negative online, right? And then after 5 o'clock, it starts peaking, really cruising around 9 to 11 p.m. And so he broke it up into 3 sections. He says what you want to do is, in the early morning, you want to do the really heavy lifting stuff, the stuff that requires real thought. He says after 11 or 12 o'clock, you want to do the administrative stuff, the mindless stuff. Let me do this, and just respond. And then what was interesting, when it starts kicking back up after around 5 or 6 o'clock, he says that's when you want to do, he called it your insight work, your creative work, like what if? That's where your brain just goes off on it. And I thought that's interesting. Heavy lifting, morning, midday administrative, and in the evening, just the what if creative stuff starts flowing. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have never viewed a day kind of in those 3 segments like that, but I might actually take some advice from this interview and give it a whirl. Because just anecdotally, that seems like I get most of my important stuff done before lunch anyway. So why not double down on that and reduce all distractions and get the most out of it?
Yeah, it's a really good book. I recommend it. It's called When. And it really has some interesting, fascinating data.
Interesting. Well, so just a last question before we wrap up with the final 5 here. Where do you see the podcast industry going over the next few years? I mean, you're invested in it. We're on a rapid growth trajectory over especially the last 7 months here. Where do you see things going?
I haven't really thought about it, but my knee-jerk reaction is because for those of you who don't know, I wrote this book on artificial intelligence, which means I dug deep into what this stuff really is. And one of the things I see, if I can play futurist for just a second, is that typically when we think of AI and content, we think about written content. What's happening now is that you got to see some of these algorithms. Amazing stuff. They can actually go into a movie and find a scene for you. You say, look, I'm looking for 2 cars, guys running, tall building in the background around sunset. And the algorithm can actually find that scene for you in the movie, right? And so what is now happening is that they're starting to go into your audio and they're actually starting to mine that for data. Now, typically when we talk about data, we talk about like meta tags, right? You tag your audio file with meta tags, ID tags. Hey, this is what this podcast is about, right? Mm-hmm. Well, now the algorithms are so powerful, they can go in there, listen to the thing, determine the content for you. So no matter what you label, it doesn't matter. The system will decide for you. It can determine your sentiment. Were you pissed off? Were you angry? Were you happy? Were you sad? What were you? It'll pull that stuff out. And so all of a sudden, all these audio files are now becoming databases of information. So they're collecting all this data. So to me, when I see the future of podcasts, I see a future where they're going to mine this stuff either for, if we mention Coke, do you know what I mean? It's going to find this podcast because it'll mine for that word. And so I think podcasts might be used to actually make machines more intelligent. How that will benefit us, I have no idea. But I think podcasts will now be used as data storage devices to help machines make more intelligent decisions when it comes to, tone, sentiment. How do I feel about this? What people are saying. Imagine the future where politicians could actually mine this type of audio data to kind of get a consensus of what the population thinks. It's citizenry. What are they thinking, right? And then it'll be able to crunch all these podcasts and figure out what's what. That's what I think is amazing. Where it's going, I have no idea.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting insight. Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about it from that lens, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you're going to train natural language processing algorithms, why not use natural language found in podcasts, right? It makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Interesting. All right, well, let's wrap it up with the final five, Victor. You mentioned Atomic Habits, but aside from that, what's the best book you have recently read?
The Effortless Experience. The Effortless Experience, it was written by, I think it was Matt Dixon, Adamson or something like that. The Effortless Experience is one of those books you read. And this came out like 4 years ago. And this book proves to me that, because it doesn't have a lot of ratings. And I'm like, why doesn't this book have a lot of ratings? It talks about how people buy today. And the more effortless you can make the experience, the more likely they are to buy. In a world of product parity, where everything's a commodity, we have the equality of quality. The quality is all the same. Everything's the same. What customers are looking for is make it easy for me to buy from you. And this book really digs into how that is working. Now, if you're a salesperson, this matters. If you're an organization, this really matters. And without going into too much detail, it really talks about how you can set up even conversations to make buying easy. One of my favorite studies was they moved the reset your password button to a different part of the page and made it a one-step process. And all of a sudden, their offline business, people showing up to, let's say, Wells Fargo to, hey, can you help me with this? That dropped by like 47%, some crazy number like that. Just by understanding that by making it present, putting it in a place where people can find it, shortening the process, making it effortless, that people would rather deal with the machine than go see a human being. And that was a cost-effective strategy. So The Effortless Experience would be a book I'd highly recommend. And as we've talked about already, Atomic Habits, excellent book, must read. That's going to be on my always recommend to people. That's how good it is.
Yeah, I am going to have to pick that up after this. I am intrigued. Number 2, who are your favorite podcasters right now? Maybe one or two podcasts you love right now.
Podcasts. Staples are Gary V., right? I like the Joe Rogan show when I hear that. I like the interview styles. I think it's about it. I'm trying to remember this guy's name, and I can't remember. It's EO, Entrepreneurs on Fire, and I can't remember.
Oh, Johnny Lee Dumas.
Yeah, there you go. I like his stuff also. I like him because he's just so, he's so Ron Howard Opie when he talks, and he's so human. He's so, you know what I mean? He's so real, and I dig that about him. Plus, he lives in Puerto Rico. So you can, get some good tax benefits from there. So I salute him for that. But I try to listen to, there's one called AI in Industry. I forgot the guy's name, where he talks about just about AI. And I think his podcasts are excellent. And I think those are the ones I typically listen to. A little technical, a little motivation. And then, the standard. Gary V, Joe Rogan, some of these guys.
Awesome. What does your ideal pizza look like? What do you get on your pizza?
Oh man, I like the Supreme, man. I'm a meat lover, so when they can throw all the junk on top of it, but I got to be honest, man, I'm starting to really, really like extra tomatoes. I think, by the way, the biggest sin is when people put pineapple on their pizza. I think that's wrong. I think that should be outlawed. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
What about anchovies? How do you feel about anchovies?
I love anchovies, man. I'm starting, it's funny because, I love the meat lovers, right? And so now I'm starting to kind of move towards more vegetables as I'm getting older or something. And so I'm starting to crave that a little more. But yeah, favorite meat is chicken if you're going to ask.
Perfect. So dead or alive, who is the person you'd love to interview the most? So say if you had an interview podcast, if there was one person throughout history, who would you like to interview?
Prince. I'm a Prince fan. Yeah, I'm a Prince fan. I just, Prince and the Revolution. I think, to me, he was like the musical Beethoven of our time. Guy plays 23, 26 instruments. And I think his library of music is just incredible. And I think he was a few degrees off center, which would make that even more interesting. And so the only question I would have is, will he actually talk? How he just never really wanted to talk or open up. But if I can get him to open up, he would be, I think, a fascinating interview. Absolutely. Yeah, we always play, me and my friends, when we get together, we play the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame video where they play When My Guitar Gently Weeps, I believe, the Beatles song, and he does the incredible solo and just throws his guitar up in the air. He killed it, man. He killed that thing. That's one of the best solos, man. Favorite song is, I think, it's still Little Red Corvette. Oh, yeah. He was, oh, man. Yeah,
I mean, because later on, obviously, he went more the pop route, but like his guitaring skills are like undeniable. Like he was an incredible guitarist.
But I mean, just a musician in general. If you really listen to I was always impressed with Dove Cries. Well, if you hear the backstory was he just took out the bass. He says, "Here's a song. Let's put no bass on this thing. Let's just take it out." And all of a sudden, the song becomes a hit, which is basically a bunch of drums and synthesizers. So I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
Awesome.
See, I mean, I just light up when I think of the guy because it'd be a fascinating interview.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Prince would be an awesome interview. May he rest in peace. Final question. What would you do differently if you were to start a podcast from scratch today?
Oh, good question. I don't have a lot of regrets in the podcast in the way I started. I'm trying to think, do I have any regrets? The answer is no. I don't have any regrets. I think, it's gone according to plan, maybe more, but I think the pace is good. The one that nags me in the back of my mind, DJ, is because, I don't have any guests. I don't do guests, right? And that's what people keep pinging me about. Why don't you have guests, Victor? And, because they can help you market, so forth and so on. So maybe eventually I'll relent. And maybe I'll find out that I really take off after that. And then I'll be kicking myself in the ass. And I'll call you back up, DJ. Now I have your answer. I should have had guests on my show. So that might be it.
Awesome. Well, Victor, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's been a lot of fun, dude. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate you opening up about your process and sharing some of the numbers and all of that different stuff. I think there's a ton of value in here. People are going to get a lot out of this, so I appreciate it, man.
I hope so, man. If you're thinking of a podcast and this, I mean, think about it, man. I mean, let me just get on my soapbox for 30 seconds. Yeah. We have the ability, because I'm older than probably some of you listening to this. Back then you had to rent. I mean, if somebody said to me, "Hey, look, how would you like to transmit your voice all over the world?" Me might say, "Well, how much is that going to cost?" Because I got to go to a studio, right? I got to rent these antennas, have my own tower. I mean, think about it: the internet, YouTube, a podcast. People are listening to you around the world, and it's free. I mean, you just, I don't know. Sometimes I think millennials just take that for granted, but I'm like, dude, it's free. Why aren't you doing something?
Absolutely. And everyone, yes, please go check out the Sales Influence Podcast. Victor, where can everyone find you on the interwebs?
Just victorantonio.com, or just type in Victor Antonio and check out the podcast. Again, the Sales Influence Podcast. I think you'll love it, and short to the point. Good stuff.
Absolutely. I love the slogan, by the way. I forgot to touch on that. Finding the why and how people buy. I think it's so clever and so concise. Well done.
Yeah. I started thinking about, why is it that people make buying decisions? And that's where it came from. Finding the why and how people buy. And by the way, everybody tells me, because at the end, you know how I ended, right? Selling ain't hard when you know how, right? I can't tell you how many times people spit that at me. That's when you know you got a brand. You know what I mean? People go, "Hey, Victor, selling ain't hard when you know how." I'm like, "Yeah, thank you. I know that." So it's cool when you can come up with your own little riff.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Victor. I appreciate it.
DJ, thank you, brother.